Should our spaces behave exactly the same every hour of every day? You see, back in the day, before the Industrial Revolution, our spaces were just that, spaces. There was no bathroom, living room, bedroom, none of that. There was just room. These are all modern constructs of our modern ways of living. Today, architects are meant to conceive a space thinking of the use behind such space. But the question remains, up to what point? How far in should an architect go when designing a certain space? If you're new, I'm Pedro. I'm a licensed architect here in Brussels, Belgium, and I specialize in sustainable environmental design. Now, the famous Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio, he actually came up with a concept of designing spaces for summer and spaces for winter. Seasonal rooms, if you will. These rooms would of course be differentiated by their orientation and their overall proportions. So summer rooms would be kept in the shade, facing the north and the east, because he was from Italy, the northern hemisphere. And winter rooms were kept facing the south and the west to get extra heat from the sun. Additionally, winter rooms were meant to be significantly smaller than summer rooms, because the latter would allow heat to rise and then dissipate, while the former, so the winter rooms, would be easier to heat up. And it was also easier to keep and maintain that warmth. Am I suggesting to you that we should be building our houses twice as big so that we can have a summer wing and a winter wing? Well, we should all be so lucky. But of course, I'm not suggesting that, because that is not sustainable. And we're not all servicing, as Andrea Palladio was back in the day, the affluent merchant class. What I am suggesting though is that we can take a page from his book. And in this video, I'll share 3 concepts to illustrate to you why this is so important. And the first of these concepts starts with you, as always. I've had clients come to me and tell me, hey Pedro, I want my house to have 20 or 22 degrees throughout, every hour of every day, throughout the year. And you can probably relate to this demand, but I can guarantee to you that you'd be probably not miserable in this space, but you wouldn't be as happy as you probably think. And most certainly, this is not a guarantee of thermal comfort. Our comfort demands oscillate throughout the months and seasons, as I explained in my dedicated video to comfort, which I'll link below. But something I did not mention in that video is that our internal temperatures oscillate throughout the day, and so do our thermal requirements. When you're about to wake up, if you have more or less the same daily routine, or let's just take me for example, I usually go to bed and wake up at roughly the same time. So when I'm about to wake up, my body temperature starts to rise, indicating that a new activity is going to develop. And it continues rising throughout the day until it reaches its peak in the afternoon, when it starts to drop again, cueing my body that it's soon going to be time to rest, to get some sleep. The space I'm in should not combat these body fluctuations. It should not provide me additional heat as my heat is dropping. Quite the contrary, actually. It should actually help me achieve these levels. That's why we sleep better in cooler rooms than we do in warmer rooms. But to a certain degree, of course. No, let's keep things rational. You see, our internal clocks are actually called, by us pedantics, the circadian rhythm. And it's important to understand where this word comes from. If you break it down, it means circa, close to or around, and dian is a derivative of diam, which means day. So around a day. And why is it around and not exactly a day? That's the reason why we actually require daylight and we need these thermal fluctuations so our internal clocks can regulate. You see, our internal clocks are not exactly Swiss made. They're off, and not by just a few minutes. Quite a few of them actually. Daylight actually helps us understand what time of day it is so that our clocks can adapt accordingly. The same happens with temperature. We as humans, thanks to evolution, tend to understand that cooler times mean that bedtime is approaching. Our bodies require external inputs or stimuli in order to get our clocks working correctly again and matching the 24-hour daily cycle, because our clocks otherwise would not match the daily cycle if we're not constantly being cued as to what time of day it is. That's why we need these fluctuations in temperature and daylight. This partly explains why it's so hard to wake up in the morning during the winter time. I mean, it's dark out, it's still cold. All the stimuli our bodies are getting is that it's still not time to get up. Why? Because we evolved in a climate which is nothing to do with the climate of Brussels, where I live. In his New York Times bestseller book, Why We Sleep, PhD Matthew Walker goes as far as to say the likelihood of an Olympic record being broken is directly related to the time of day that event is taking place, because our bodies perform optimally at our peak internal body temperature, so in the afternoon. And by the way, that book is brilliant. It's a brilliant read, so I highly recommend it. He also defends that it's easier to fall asleep in a cooler room than it is in a warmer one. And this is of course the case because a cooler room is helping our bodies reduce the internal temperature, which is what our bodies are actually doing. I can understand this and I relate to this concept. This is what happens to me. Unfortunately, this is not how my better half sees it, but even I have come across studies which sustain this. And they say that we can sleep perfectly fine in rooms with only 14 degrees Celsius. Another PhD, who I'm proud to say was actually a teacher of mine back in Buenos Aires, John Martin Evans, he argues that it's actually more important not to have too high of a thermal fluctuation when we sleep than the temperature itself. Meaning that as long as we don't have more than a 2-degree temperature fluctuation per hour, then normally the temperature should not be a thing to wake us up. And the bottom line is our internal body temperature is not constant, and we require different temperatures throughout the day and for different activities. Therefore, we have to allow for these fluctuations to happen in the spaces we're building, because it's in part from these fluctuations that our internal clocks get regulated. And this leads me nicely into my second point of the day. Let's refer back to Palladio's seasonal rooms and how these later became rooms allocated for different activities. We architects, when we design a space, we know to the comma how wide a corridor needs to be. We know when we're designing kitchens that kitchen furniture tends to be 60 to 70 centimeters deep, depending on who you're working with. We also understand that a bedroom should not be smaller than X square meters, and that will heavily depend on the cultural setting where this building would be happening. That would be 9 square meters here in Brussels. But we don't really consider how each space is going to be used, and probably more importantly, at what time of day that given space will be used. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, we were designing a daycare center. Similar to office spaces, daycare centers tend to have regular working hours. They tend to work since early in the morning, say 7 o'clock in the morning, all the way until 6 in the afternoon. That means that about 2/3 of the day, the building would just be closed for business. No one will be using that space. So we should optimize only for the hours when that building is actually going to be used. This frame of mind is what allowed us to understand that when we looked at daylight, we actually did not have only 5,000 lux 40% of the time. We actually had 5,000 lux 75% of the time, and that allowed us to understand that we can reduce the size of our windows to preserve heat in, which was very important because our users were mainly children. These children are kept in undergarments because diapers need changing very often. We have to acknowledge that they don't have the possibility to thermally adapt by adding or removing layers of clothing. So the heating demand will actually be higher than standard. as there is no real room for thermal adaptation. Reducing the window sizes was part of our strategy. But the other part of the strategy is the third concept I'm discussing here in this video today. And it comes down to this. If we're willing to acknowledge that our temperature requirements change throughout the day and that different spaces require different thermal settings at different times, then all we need to do now is couple that with the environment. And we do this through orientation. And that is the other strategy we applied to our daycare center, as we had our common areas where children were going to be playing facing the south, and the bedrooms where they would be sleeping further and further out east and west, as you can see in the image. Now let me give you another example. As I said before, I usually go to bed and wake up in the same room. I say usually because, again, I have small children and I'm not always so lucky. However, that same room can offer me the temperature requirements I need for falling asleep late at night and for waking up early in the morning. This is why we architects tend to have our bedrooms face east, so that we can benefit from the morning sun, which will be long gone by the time we hit the bed later that day. Now, I understand that this is not always the case. We're not always so lucky. We cannot always have all of our bedrooms facing east, but we should at least study and consider the possibilities. And this applies not only to bedrooms and daycare centers or even offices. It applies to every space that we conceive. Let me finish off by sharing this other project I did about 10 years ago for a competition here in Brussels, Belgium. It was an international gastronomic center. Again, this project was about 10 years ago, so I'm sorry for the quality of the images, but the concept is what I want you to grasp and understand. You see, what I did was break down the program and determine what were the requirements for each of the spaces that I was creating. And I based this criteria based on solar availability, daylight, ventilation, privacy, and finally, and most importantly probably, is time of day when that space was going to be used. Once I had this down, I took out a compass and determined where the views were. Again, probably this doesn't have anything to do with sustainability, but a building that is not working properly or is just ugly and needs to be torn down is, again, not sustainable at all, and I hope we can agree on that. Once that was done, I started overlaying my program, the one I determined, and based on the requirements I had set, I determined which angles those spaces could afford to look at. Now, I probably didn't get all that I really wanted. I probably didn't get all the rooms I wanted facing east to face east, but at least I took a decision, an active decision of this space is not going to be facing south or east, although it could or should, because I want to have this other space, which is more important hierarchically, is that a word? It's more important in terms of hierarchy, and I simply cannot have all my spaces in the same orientation. I have to make sacrifices, and that is what designing is all about. But again, these are informed decisions thanks to the concept that we analyzed each program requirement and determined the orientation. And that is what design is all about. At the end of the day, we have to understand that we humans are the product of 20,000 years of evolution in paradise virtually. Living as I am here in the northern latitude is actually not natural if you take it literally from that term, which is why we have to pay attention to matters of daylight and thermal comfort, which is why I spoke at length in these other two videos. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you there. Thanks, bye. In the books. Got it.